So it's probably not a surprise for any of us here that language facilitates learning and communication. What I find most fascinating is that language helps us learn about things that we did not experience directly. And if you think about it, that's actually the majority of our language use. So we talk about people that we've never met. This is Mary Curie. I'm pretty certain none of us have met her in person. The remote places, other people's thoughts, we cannot directly experience or observe them. And then there are also things that just don't have a perceptual manifestation, which are abstract ideas such as infinity. And this kind of communication is a hallmark of our species and practices, and it shapes our clinical interventions. This is what we want to be able to do with language. And so the questions that I'm asking here, and today I'm going to be kind of taking a bit of a more applied approach here. So I'm asking how and when does this ability emerge? So does the communication about the unseen emerge? And when I say unseen, I don't necessarily mean unseen as like one modality. We can talk about things that are untouched, unsmelled, etc. So in any way not perceptually experienced. And the question is also, what can we do to support it, right? If we are parents, teachers, caregivers, policymakers, what can we do to support children's learning of this communication? So, when we talk about communication about the unseen, we need to consider something for a moment, and that's broader context of language development in the first several years of life, and specifically in the first year, because my focus is very little ones. I'm talking about babies. So my work is mostly with children that are between 0 and 24 months old. So in the first year, language learning tends to be centered around perceptually available things, like perceptually present objects or observable events. And that's in parents' speech, it's everywhere. So we know that infants start off knowing words for objects around them, like a cat, a dog, a truck, etc. And parents also make most effort in labeling those kinds of objects or observable events. And so as a result, language learning tends to be grounded in associative learning and in perceptual salience. So things that are most bright, most attractive would be attended to, right? And then when parents or caregivers or teachers talk about those things, this is when children will start making associations between the word, say a dog, and the entity that it refers to. But then we need to transition somehow from that to being able to talk about things that are absent or abstract. And actually, we know that by about age 2, children have no problem. I mean, not exactly no problem. They sometimes make errors, but generally speaking, they can refer to absent caregivers. They can refer to the toy that they want right now and it's not around them. So what happens? And so I'm going to talk today about two components that I think are key. They are not the only two components, but these are the components that I think are the most important building blocks of our ability to talk about things that are not perceptually present or perceptually don't exist, like abstract ideas. And the first thing is knowing that language communicates in the first place. And it's not as trivial as it may sound, because it's very intuitive for us. Like, of course, language communicates. What else can it do? But when you're a baby born into this world, you're surrounded by all kinds of signals. You see people making these vocal productions. If you're a deaf baby and you have speakers of sign language, you realize that sign is kind of something really important, and you observe a lot of that. But you also observe people walking, breathing, blinking, gesturing, all kinds of things. So how do you decide? The first thing is knowing that language communicates in the first place. And what we know, based on existing research and things that I will show you today, is that this capacity is present at the very least by 12 months. I'm not necessarily saying it's not present anywhere earlier, but the best data that we have suggests that by 12 months, we're at that point. So what I'm going to show you is the ability to recognize that language is communicative is present at around 12 months, or at least by that point. Now, the other capacity that I find really key to being able to communicate about something that's unseen, and again, it's a shorthand for anything that's not perceptually experienced directly, is connecting words with that unseen something. And so to use a technical term that we use in cognitive psychology, it's representations of something that's unseen. So some kind of mental image or some kind of idea of what the unseen is. And then we need to be able to connect that to words. And so what I'm going to show you is that that capacity is present at least by 15 months. And at that point, what children can do is they can establish that mental image based on language. They can retrieve it and they can modify it. And that's what we need, right? In order to learn from language, in order to communicate about something, we need to be able to establish these representations. For example, I can tell you, I have a sister. Now you have some idea. You have never met her. She is not perceptually present in our joint perceptual field, and yet you can have that idea. Now I can tell you she works in London. Oh, you modified that representation, but before you modified it, you retrieved it. Because you don't constantly keep it active in your mind. Okay, so these are the capacities I'll be talking about today. And I'll start with figuring out how do we learn that language is communicative in the first place. First of all, let me give you a little bit of a background. So what we already know about the communicative power of language. So we know from some research that 1-year-olds might have some idea that language is serving the communicative function. So how do we know? So I really like this study. I'm going to try to replicate it and use it in my own research. So here is a study conducted by Martin Nisha and Vulumanas. What they've done here is they introduced infants in a live kind of stage setup to 2 people. This person is called the communicator. And this person has a funnel, and she tries to put a ring on a funnel, but you see that this screen is blocking her, so she repeatedly fails. So infants actually never see what the completed outcome. Then they see this person, and this person we call the recipient. And this person shows that she can reach the ring and funnel, but has no particular intention with regard to either. And finally, infants see this scene where the communicator turns to the recipient and says one nonsense word. She says "koba." And then there are multiple outcomes. So one outcome is that the recipient fulfills that intention and puts the ring in the funnel. That's in the outcome that infants have never seen until the test. Or she imitates the failed action, or she does something irrelevant, just plays around with the ring and funnel. Turns out that infants find the outcome where she fulfills the communicator's intention most expected, which tells us what? It tells us that infants have some idea that that one word, "koba," somehow transferred the information from one person's mind, the communicator, to the recipient, and the recipient acted on that information. That does not work with non-communicative gesture, doesn't work with other sounds like throat clearing. So something about language must be special in that it helps infants figure out that communication has occurred. All right, so how do we get there? And so here is a candidate pathway. I'm going to define this term. So we call it social contingency. There's a bit of a delay. That's good. We can.
Socially contingent? Yes.
It's perfectly contingent. It bothers me, actually. If you go into the research on social contingency, perfect contingency is not what we want. Okay, so what is social contingency? So social contingency is a property of reciprocal social interaction. So basically, when you and I are talking, when you and I are interacting, what do we do? Well, first, when we respond to each other, we respond to each other promptly. We don't wait for like 5 minutes unless we give a special warning. Okay, so in infant research, the temporal alignment has to be within 2 seconds. So if a baby, for example, produced some kind of babble, Though to be socially contingent, the parent's response has to be within 2 seconds. After that, it kind of starts to fall apart a little bit. Now, that interval is much shorter for adults. If adults don't get a response within 400 milliseconds, they start repeating the communicative bit. It's actually pretty long. Like if I say, can you give me a cup? And only now you say no. I'll be like, well, did you really have to wait for that long? Did you think about it? Okay, but for infants, the interval is about 2 seconds. That's the typical cutoff in developmental research. And of course, the response has to be directed at the interlocutor, okay? If I say, what time is it? And you just get up and go, that is temporarily aligned, but it's not really directed at me. So it doesn't feel like an action that was actually meant to respond to my question. Okay, so this is what I mean by social contingency. And what I propose here is that when infants observe that language triggers behaviors and other changes in their environment that could not conceivably be triggered by anything else, they infer that language must somehow transfer information from one mind to another. So again, the example, if I say, oh, can you please bring me my cup? And nothing else in our environment should suggest that somebody should get up and leave and come back with a cup. So this is where infants start inferring potential causality. Like, okay, so she did this vocal nonsense and received what she seems to have intended to receive. Okay, that is an important bit of data. So language must somehow transfer information from one mind to another. All right. Okay, and so then there is a more fine-grained observation. What we observe now is that when we utter different words and different phrases, different outcomes seem to follow. And that helps infants figure out that specific words and phrases might convey specific information. And then if we take these inferences and we couple them with other learning capacities, so infants have a lot of general learning capacities such as associative learning, statistical learning. And so when we take them in combination, that helps us build a foundation for language development. So we know that language seems to be doing something about transferring information. We know that specific things seem to be related to specific outcomes. And we can actually build associations between those specific utterances and the specific outcomes. So here is how we kind of have the foundation for language learning and for the development of early lexicon. Now, do we have any evidence that this might be the case? Well, yes, we have some evidence that comes from a lot of correlational studies, and I'll put up some citations here, but in fact, there are, at this point, hundreds of these citations. So we know that when infants in the first year of life vocalize and parents respond contingently, so within 2 seconds and directed to the baby, that tends to predict vocabulary size early in the second year. And in particular, the more parents respond, the larger infants' vocabularies tend to be. And that's an important sort of practical point. We already know that responding to babies perhaps helps. What I'm interested in is how, right? Why am I interested in that? Well, because one possibility, and that's the possibility that I'm exploring here, is that the more likely parents are to respond, the more likely infants are to make the inference about the communicative nature of language and vocalizations. And that should then build the foundation for language development. But it's not the only possibility. And if technology permits, we'll find out what the alternatives are. Okay, so we also can imagine that more responsive parents produce more language input. And you may be familiar with these classic findings by Hart and Risley, suggesting that more language input correlates with larger vocabulary sizes, even in older children, not babies. So it's possible that more responsive parent just produces more for infants to work with, more data. The other possibility is that it could be that when parents respond contingently, they also simplify their language. We all know, I mean, many of us know the idea of infant-directed speech, right? Which is exaggerated prosody, like, hey, baby. And it's slower and it's hyper-articulated, and it's just easier to parse words out of that from that kind of speech. So the more of that kind of input infants receive, the better it is for their language development. All right. And so what I'm trying to do here in this study is to tease these possibilities apart, because if we are talking about supporting children's language development, it's not enough to just know that talking to your baby helps. It actually helps to know how it helps, why it helps, and what it is that we can modify. Okay, so how do we distinguish? So here in the study, I used the Rollins corpus collected by Pamela Rollins. Thank you very much for sharing it publicly. It was amazing. It's actually the best corpus we could find for the purposes of this study. Okay, and so what the corpus consisted of were naturalistic parent-infant interactions. We worked with 22 dyads. There were a few more, but we had to exclude them because some parents reported some outlandish vocabulary sizes for their babies. So we thought, we're not sure how realistic that is. So that was recorded at 9 months, and infants and parents were given a set of toys and books to play with. So it's sort of semi-scripted, I guess, in that regard. But it's really good because it's uniform across all dyads. So all dyads were given the exact same things to talk about. And then infants' vocabulary was recorded when they were about 12 months. It was also recorded subsequently multiple times, but we looked at the 12-month-old data. And then there are a couple of technical terms here, receptive and productive vocabulary. Receptive is the number of words that a baby can understand. So they receive vocabulary, that's receptive. Productive is the number of words they can say. So that's, they produce it. And what we used as our predictors is the probability of parents' responses to the babies. And they were either verbal or nonverbal. Verbal is, you know, saying something. Nonverbal is like touching a baby, giving a baby a toy, or something like that. And so what we found is that when parents responded to their babies babbling in a verbal way, so they spoke back at their babies, that predicted the receptive vocabulary, meaning the number of words the babies understand. All right, so that's good. That's kind of trending in the right direction, and it's consistent with prior literature. A lot of prior work has found that this is indeed the case. This is our graph. Like you can see that there is kind of a dependence. So this is the parents respond, the larger the vocabulary that we observe at 12 months. Then again, we wanted to consider the alternative possibilities because we're asking how, why do we have this effect? And so what we've done here, I'm going to just put this all on the slides and gloss over it because it's a little technical, but it's good to see. So what we've done here is we have conducted our regression analysis, including the factors that could be the confounding variables, well, with respect to my hypothesis, right? So in this top regression, we added the measures of language input, so how much parents speak to their babies, and it turns out that the effect that we observed of parents' responsiveness is still there. So this is the important thing, it's the p-value. And then we have done the same thing with the measures of language simplicity, how much parents simplify language when they respond to their babies, and suspense. Yeah, still statistically significant. All right. So basically what it means that even when we control for the amount of language input and when we control for the simplicity of language input, we still observe the effect of parents' responsiveness. So responding to the baby's vocalizations is somehow supportive of vocabulary growth. Then, of course, you know, it's it's part of the story, but it's not the whole story. Because, you know, whenever we try to make a claim that something helps or supports infants' inferences or supports some kind of development, observational data is only one hint. It is not giving us the causal component just yet, but it does help us tease apart the possibilities. So what I'm saying here is that even though parents vary in how much they speak to their babies, even though parents vary in how simple their speech is, what's important is how often they respond. Okay, and I say probability here because it's per vocalization. Some babies vocalize a little, some babies vocalize a lot, but it doesn't, but what matters is that for each vocalization, how likely is the parent to say something in return? Okay, so, but now, just to summarize, we know that probability now of parents' responses predicts infants' vocabulary size, and that's controlling for input. We also controlled and explored a few other possibilities. These are somewhat technical, so I'll gloss over them, but if you have questions, if you're worried about any other confounding variables or possibilities, I can walk you through how we tried to take care of that. Now, we actually have another study that's currently under review, the revised version of it, that shows that when infants do things other than vocalizing, when infants shift their gaze and parents respond, that also predicts their vocabulary, which is kind of in line with the whole idea, right? It doesn't have to be vocalizations. Infants don't know yet that their vocalizations necessarily have to trigger some responses from the environment. It might be any behavior. And so what we're learning is that when infants just have some kind of communicative bid, so they could vocalize or they could look at something of their interest. And when the parents respond, that tends to also support language development. So it might be the case that indeed, when infants experience this kind of responsiveness, that leads to their inference about the communicative nature of language. But of course, we need direct experimental evidence if we were to make that claim. And again, why we want to make that claim? Well, because we want to understand how can we support babies' language. And so I'm going to show you a couple of fun videos of the current studies that are trying to produce that causal evidence. And so what we do here is we're trying to see if we were to introduce a new signal, one that babies have never previously encountered, and embed it in what we call these socially contingent interactions, right? Reciprocal, directed at each other. Will they think that this new signal is communicative? So the example I'm going to show you is a little bit engineered, right? It's kind of a highly abstracted research study, but you can imagine that, if you're a hearing baby who has been growing up learning vocal language, and then you encounter sign language for the first time, would you actually think, oh, this could also be something that is communicative, right? So can we actually show that this is the case? So here's one example of a video that for now our adult participants view, but soon we'll adapt it to babies. But basically what happens for this duration of the video is that tone sound is paired with emotions of these two furry, egg-shaped Furbies. And this is our minimal condition, where we have no cues to the idea that a Furby might be a person, a Furby might have what we call agency, some kind of desires, intention to communicate. So all we have is these two things that are kind of, when they move, you can see they're a little bit oriented towards each other at 45 degrees. And they are producing these tone sounds. And then we have other conditions. We have 30 conditions in the study, in fact, where we introduce various pieces of kind of cues to communication, including eyes and ears and things like that. So let's see. So this is the alternative. Okay, this is what we call sort of like a full set of these agentic features, meaning that they're accused to agency. These are sentient beings that have some desire to communicate. And then they produce the same sounds, or they produce actually human speech. So our very basic control condition, they actually produce a dialogue. And the dialogue we took from the Titanic movie. Yeah. And then we converted that to sine wave tones. So the question is, will our participants make an inference that sine wave tones are a way to exchange information? So for now, we're doing it with adults, and I took a quick peek at the data. It turns out that yes, adults are making these inferences, and they're making those inferences kind of according to the hypothesis. So we thought that if there is contingency, even if there are no eyes, even if there are no ears, but there is this sort of reciprocity and temporal alignment, the adults are making inferences that basically these two things are kind of talking or conversing in some way. If there's only one thing, they don't make that inference necessarily. And if there are two things, but they're not moving in synchrony with those sounds, so there's no cue that they're the ones producing them, they also don't make that inference. Now that we know that, what we're going to do next is we're going to adapt these studies to babies. Probably not with Furbies, but with actual human beings. And then we'll go back to the design I showed you with the communicator and the recipient and see if once that babies have observed that novel signal embedded in socially contingent exchange, will they think now that a person can communicate to another person using that signal? And if that's the case, that will be the bit of evidence that we're currently kind of missing. That will be the bit of evidence that we want to make that causal claim. So the study that I want to conduct to follow up on this is to see what happens. And you may have noticed that there are, AI is everywhere, and it's entering kind of the world of children very rapidly. There are now AI-based toys. There are now chatbot-powered kind of companions, sometimes learning companions. And it's coming from industry. It's also coming from educators and scientists. There is MIT has developed this. I forgot what they call it, but anyway, so there's basically a kind of like a learning companion toy, very much looking like a Furby, that uses a chatbot to guide children's learning and exploration. Now, it can be problematic for a variety of reasons, some of the same reasons that we always worry about: exposure to screens, exposure to TV, and things like that. So if it's replacing human child interactions, it can be a problem. But it can also be really helpful if we do it right. Imagine a deaf child born to a hearing family, the hearing family that doesn't speak the sign language yet. How can we use these technologies, for example, to kind of help that child not get into the risky situation where they are experiencing early language deprivation just because nobody around them speaks sign language, right? And we know that early language deprivation is bad for children. It can cause like lasting effects on their capacity to reason, on their capacity to even remember things, because it turns out that language is heavily involved in the forming of memory. And so generally speaking, we want language input, especially for these vulnerable groups, such as, say, deaf children born to hearing families. We can also think about a variety of other contexts when parents are unavailable, working multiple jobs, or for some other reason, their children are not getting enough language input, right? So what I'm going to do in this study is to see simultaneously whether manipulating the level of contingency of AI helps with language learning, and whether at the same time we're observing any sort of adverse social effects. For example, a baby might be forming too much attachment to the AI, and that's problematic for a variety of reasons. Well, it also might just give babies some wrong idea about what social interactions are like, because I don't know, if you try ChatGPT and try to talk to ChatGPT, you change the topic, it has no problem. It like never tells you like, wait a second, what the hell? It just responds. It never punishes you. It never reprimants you. It doesn't hug. There's a lot of things that it doesn't do. Currently, it's not to say that it will stay like that forever. There's also a whole area of developmental robotics that are actually doing like this embodied AI. So embodied AI can do a little bit more with regard to interacting with a child. It's just not very good right now, but maybe at some point it will be. And so the thing is, what I want is I want to anticipate the moment when we can have high quality embodied child-centric AI. And what can we do to maximize the learning benefits and to minimize the social harm? So these are the next steps. Okay, so now I want to spend a bit of time that we have left talking about connecting words with those ideas of the unseen. All right, so when does that begin to start with? Well, to answer this question, and I'll skip over some of the overview of what we already know just in the interest of time. So I have conducted this study where 15-month-old infants, and we know that these infants are already pretty proficient word learners. They're already pretty proficient at representing things that are not present. They will search for things that were around them and were recently hidden. So now we took these infants and gave them the following scenario. So this was done on video, so that's why we could implement it. This was an experimenter who had things pop up behind her back. So for example, here's an apple, an orange, and a banana, and she'll be like, oh, an apple, baby, do you see the apple? And then, oh, an orange, baby, do you see the orange? Then she moves on to do that with the banana, so you kind of get the gist. And then she moves on to the fourth event, where she'll be like, oh, baby, a Modi. Oh, do you like Modis? Here's a Modi. But it turns out that this whole time, when she was introducing the Modi, she was entirely occluding the object, so the baby has never seen it. And so what we're trying to do here, we're trying to see if we can basically plant a representation of something the baby hasn't seen into the baby's mind, convince the baby that there is something behind this experimenter's back, basically, right? Get them to think that that something is being named because, well, 3 times before then, she was naming things that were behind her back, so she must be naming it again. And convince the baby that perhaps that something must be, a fruit or something edible, something related to the kitchen. So a representation that's somehow informed by what we have shown so far. And if that's the case, by the time we get to this phase when we test them, we show them 2 things. We show them another fruit, and this is a pitaya fruit, which, considering our population, basically North American babies, they're less likely to be familiar with the pitaya fruit. And at the very least, even if they have seen it, they might not know its name, which was great for us. And then there is something sort of mildly perceptually matched, which is a distractor object. It's an ottoman. You can see that it's matched by color and some of the contrasts of yellow and brown. And so what we say at this point, can you find the Modi? If our baby has used the language context in which the Modi was introduced, successfully created a representation of that Modi, and attached that word to that representation, they should be looking at the pitaya fruit. And of course, we didn't just have the pitaya fruit, we had various domains, we had, animals, and we had clothing and vehicles. So it's not, we were not always about fruits. Okay, so what do we find? Can 15-month-olds do it? Totally. Hey, they can do that. So they actually look to the correct object substantially more than chance. Chance would be 50% when they just don't know where to look. So 50% of each. So that's amazing news. But we also had a couple of control conditions, right? Because it could be that our babies just like looking at pitaya fruit because it's a fruit, with no relation to the experimental manipulation. And so to control for that, all right, we had a condition in which the first 3 things that we showed had nothing to do with fruits. We had like a dog, a car, and I think like a jacket. So this way the baby is thoroughly uninformed about what that fourth object might be. And as we predicted, they did not have any preference. They looked at both kind of equally. Okay, and what this shows is that there is a statistically significant difference. This is what we want as scientists, right? It's not random. It is to be expected based on our manipulation. And then we wanted to make sure, and this is a critical, actually really critical piece of information, are they learning the word? Are they connecting the word with that representation? Or they're looking at the fruit because we just showed them, 3 fruits. Like, okay, it's all about fruits now. Let's look at the fruit again. But if we change the word and we say, instead of modi, which is the word we taught, we say, now, baby, look at the blanket. The baby has no idea where to look. And so that tells us that indeed, at 15 months, infants can form a representation of an unseen object, or at least the object that they don't know by name. Maybe there's some slim chance that some 15-month-olds may have seen a pitaya fruit, but at least not within the study. They can link it to a novel word, and they can identify that object during the test phase, which is when it becomes visible. Now, this is great news, okay? So we know that 15-month-olds can already do this. So what we know is that by 12 months, probably, infants know that language is about communication. And by 15 months, they can pair a word with something that's just not there. But what does it actually do? Okay, so if we're talking about supporting children's language development and their communicative development, having these capacities is great, but what's next? As parents, as caregivers, as policymakers, what can we do? And so here is another study that we're now conducting that will actually inform this decision. So what we do first is we repeat this same experiment that I've shown you just now, and we do that at 15 months. And then what we do next is we're trying to see what happens with these babies when they're 24 months. So at this point, they're fairly verbal. At this point, they're quite engaged with the social world and they use language. But are they very good at learning new information from language? And so what we take advantage of is the natural difference between different babies who went through our study at 15 months. Now we bring them back at 24 months and we just give them facts. So instead of giving them all of this kind of like audio visuals, simple stimuli, we give them a person on the screen that says, greens are green and grimps live in water. And then we show them a picture that either matches or mismatches that. And so the question is, will they look to the correct picture? Which one is the grim? So these are facts, right? So only verbal input at this point. I mean, they can see the face of the experiment, but that's it. We of course have a control condition where we just say something irrelevant about grimps, like they're my favorite, they're awesome. And we do that with some number of various stimuli to see if we actually can predict based on how well our 15-month-olds were at connecting words with representations of something that they haven't seen. So it's sort of like a building block. Now, does that predict how well they learn new facts from language? And so that is the important thing, because if we find that indeed there is this relation, then we can use this first procedure as potentially some way, it will need to be adapted, but it can be used as a diagnostic tool where we can say, look, usually at 15 months, a baby should be able to pair a word with a representation of something they haven't seen. But this particular baby might be kind of lagging behind on this. And what we've shown is that actually predicts difficulties with learning from language, which is what we want to avoid, right? And so now we can guide parents' efforts, we can guide teachers, caregivers, clinicians' efforts to help babies build that capacity so that it can further scaffold learning from language. And the other thing that we're doing related to that is learning the names of not unseen things, but learning the names of abstract things. So in this study, we're basically trying to teach 15 to 18-month-olds the names of abstract relations such as same and different. And what we have shown so far is that if we engineer particular language environment in which we really highlight the conceptual structure that was being named, like same or different. Babies can do that. That's very new data. Previously, we've known that by age 3, children can do that. What I'm showing here is that between 15 and 18 months, we can already achieve that. But it requires very careful curation of what we show and how we label it. Now, why does this matter? Well, it matters because abstract vocabulary, knowing the names of abstract relations, is something that might support abstract reasoning. Okay, so if we know what the words same and different mean, we can retrieve the underlying idea rapidly, right? And we can use it in cognitive tasks that require reasoning about things like this. For example, that two things need to be the same for some kind of machine to be activated, or two things have to be different for some kind of machine to be activated. So that kind of task might be infants' performance on this kind of task, or children's at this point performance on this kind of task can be really boosted by knowing what relation we're actually trying to engage, what abstract idea we're actually trying to engage. And so we have shown that, in fact, very young infants can learn this kind of vocabulary. And so the question becomes, how can parents and caregivers help? Well, based on the design of the study, which I'm kind of glossing over because we're out of time, is if parents really would like to help their infants build the abstract vocabulary, the underlying relation has to be highlighted. What I mean by that, if we were talking about ideas like same and different, is so abstract. Imagine the language environment. I actually looked at the natural language environments using the child as database. Turns out that parents practically never label abstraction to their babies. So words like same and different are exceptionally rare compared to words like ball and car. The parents just don't go and being like, look, these are the same. Look, these are different. Look, these are the same. That does not happen. Moreover, unlike objects, which we can point to, so objects have boundaries. So we know that, this is a cloth, but we know that this is a cloth and the air around it is not a cloth because cloth is a cohesive object. It has boundaries. We know the boundaries from the physical world. Whereas with ideas that are abstract, where is the boundary between same and not same? That's where the linguistic contrast really helps. And so if parents were to help infants build that vocabulary, the context in which the labeling happens has to be kind of special, kind of what we've done here. So what happened here is that this experimenter has given our participants, let's look at the top row here, 16 trials. And we're like, same, different, same, different. And you can see that what switches from one image to another is exactly the one property that we're trying to narrow in on. If we do it anywhere closer to real world scenarios, for example, here, not just the same or different, but also the number of things varies, which is very normal. This is exactly how the real world is. The real world is messy. And so when we say these are the same, it could be like 5 objects, and these are different, it could be 2 objects. Or we also use these words. I'm giving you examples with same and different, but it could also be likely, unlikely, symmetrical, asymmetrical, fair, unfair. So these are like abstract ideas. So when we use the word same, think about it. Like you and I have the same jacket. No, we actually have 2 different jackets. It just looks the same. Or is that the same car we saw before? So now we're talking about the object's identity. It's actually literally the car we saw. Or we did it all on the same day. Where is the referent? Where the referent is nowhere at all. Referent is what we're trying to name, right? Same day. And it's also, we're talking about the time frame. We actually didn't do 2 things at the same time. We just did it within the same 24 hours. And so because of that ambiguity, narrowing in on the underlying construct is really hard for the baby, right? That's why it takes forever for them to, they track the relation like same and different when they're 3 months old. They notice things that are same, they notice things that are different, they can generalize that to a new set of examples, but it's not until like 3.5 years of age that they first show reliable comprehension of these words. And so now I'm showing you is that we can do this much earlier, but it needs a lot of curation. And maybe it needs this sort of really awkward kind of scenario where parents truly highlight things like, look, these are the same. And now I wonder which one I've been drinking from.
One's mine.
One's mine.
You're okay.
Excellent. Well, it might as well be mine. I don't know if you want to help back. Right, so these are the same, these are different, these are the same, these are different. Or like this is fair, this is unfair, this is symmetrical, this is asymmetrical. So in some cases, that really, really helps. And the natural language environment is natural and wonderful. But if we are talking about helping our babies learn the names of abstract ideas, to use them in abstract reasoning tasks, we might have to go for this sort of artificial labeling. Okay, so now to kind of sum up everything that we talked about. Responding to a baby boosts vocabulary. That's not my idea. That's what Luchkina tells us from multiple studies. But then how and when should we respond is what I'm trying to figure out. And also, what should we be responding to? So what I've shown you is that it could be speech, it could be gaze shifts. Both are good, but it could be many more things that one can respond to. Now, learning words for the unseen and abstract is hard, but it's possible, right? Well, at least according to what we've done so far. So how can we encourage the learning of this kind of words? So one idea I've just given you is sort of explicit, weird, awkward, explicit labeling of abstract ideas. And then can it shape language learning down the road? Well, this is the question I'm trying to answer with the longitudinal study. By the way, if you're a grad student, don't even try. I've started that study in 2021. And you can count between 15 months and 24 months. They're only 9 months. It's not 5 years. But with longitudinal studies, attrition rates are horrible. So very, very few participants who have done one study will be interested in following up on time for the second study. Sometimes they'll follow up, but we're like, hey, my baby's 3 now. We're like, well, it's a year too late. So the study is almost complete, but I've been saying it's almost complete for about 6 months now. It's still almost complete. I think it has now about 800 babies who went through the first phase of the study, and 85 who have gone through the second phase of the study. So again, if you're a grad student, forget about the longitudinal studies. Okay, now these processes start early, right? And so what I want to also highlight here is when should we start making the effort? Now that's a difficult question. I don't have studies that explicitly address it. I don't have, a study that would say 6 months is too early, but 8 months is just right. But what I do think, based on the bulk of literature that exists out there, is that it's actually never too early. So being responsive to a baby doesn't just help shape their language development. We know from a lot of work on social contingency outside of language development that having a contingent caregiver helps with the development of self-regulation, development of attentional control, executive functioning skills more broadly. And it also helps with emotional development. We know from studies with infants of depressed mothers that who tend to respond less frequently and with a more delay, that it tends to have some mildly adverse effects on baby's development. So when should we start? Start as early as you can, being responsive to the baby, naming things around the baby, helping them learn abstract words. It's never too early. And that's all I have for you.